Can you help me, Richard? Can you help me? Chris? All right. Can you make sure everyone gets one of these? Make sure everyone gets those. All right, so those are for your IDs. And you can put them around your neck. And thankfully, they gave you some permanent IDs this time around. Mr. Renshaw, you want to take attendance today? Oh, yep, it's right here. Can help you get more familiar with the names too.
Yeah.
Thanks, man. All right, so here's how we're gonna do this. I'm gonna start off the Zoom. They're gonna have a warm-up question to respond to. I'm gonna put it on the board for us right in front of us, okay? And we're just gonna talk it out, all right? And then from there, as long as you are active here and you know your phone's away, for the first 20-25 minutes, you will get your participation points for today. Okay. Xavier, did I give you a schedule? You do? Well, here's another one. All right, so let's get these people in. All right, good morning to those of you on Zoom. Hope you had a nice first day here. For those of you that will be coming here tomorrow, we will see you tomorrow. All right, so we're going to start off class with a question here. I'm going to go ahead and put it on the board and take over your screen share. And here's what I wanted to ask you today. So, where did the Zoomers go? Over here? Yeah. All right, so for those of you on Zoom and those of you in person, take a look at the board here. Why were the Europeans the first to, or were the Europeans first to use slavery? Why or why not? And then how did the Europeans change slavery? Okay, look at this question. Answer one or two. We didn't necessarily go over this. This would be kind of more background information, stuff you may have learned in middle school or just being a person on the earth. For those of you on Zoom, I need you to respond in the chat function. There are 15 of you out there, so we should have 15 responses. Answer one of the two questions. All right, for those of you in the room here, were the Europeans the first to use slavery in the 1500s? No. Mariah, you're shaking your head. Was there other slavery in history?
The slavery was based on like land and not.
Good. So for instance, African kingdoms, basically slavery was very common because it was used as the state owned all the land. So you kind of had to have slaves to do labor, but it wasn't the same type of slavery that the Europeans used. Okay, good. What else? Any other times in history? Did the Romans use slaves? Absolutely. Slavery was common in the Roman Empire. Yeah. Egyptians used slaves. Think about the Israelites in the Torah, in the Bible. Okay. They were enslaved in Egypt. Some other instances where slavery existed. Anyone think of any? China, India, ancient China. Slavery, in terms of even like I'm reading a book about the Middle Ages in Europe right now, and they're at the year 997 CE, so right around 1000 CE, and they have they have women concubines that are slaves. In the Muslim world, like the Islamic world after Muhammad died, women were sex slaves, concubines. Okay. Now, that type of slavery was vastly different than the European slavery. What was different? Other than what Mariah already said. What do you think? What do you think was different between the slavery that existed before and then what the Europeans used when there were no native laborers left? Let's go ahead and see what our chat box had to say. We have Europeans changed slavery by buying them from African kingdoms, which hasn't been done before, done during the time. They were used for labor. Ethan said that they made it extremely deadly and brutal. That's good. What I'm trying to get you to understand though is that the Europeans caused this thing called chattel slavery, which literally for the first time people were looked at as property and could be bought and sold. Instead of slaves being looked at as like indentured servants, or you could buy your way out of slavery, they were literally looked at as the same thing as cattle or a pig or something like that. Okay. So the Europeans in the 1500s would totally change the way slavery was established in the Americas, and obviously it affected the continent of Africa. Okay. We're gonna go ahead and make this full screen here. And today, I'd like you guys to either take notes on pen or paper. You can take notes on your computer, or you can just have these slides in front of you on your screen if you want to. It's all up to you, okay? But these are the only notes we're gonna take all week. And like I said, it's only about 8 slides. Most of them are gonna be pictures anyways, okay? If you have your headphones or anything, again, just a reminder, like yesterday, if you can take them out, so that you make sure that you're being polite to your whole class too. All right, so we're going to look at the Africa and the effect of slave trade on Africa and the Americas in the 15th to 15 to 1800s, really. So take a look at the volume of the slave trade here. So the first boat that comes over is 1519. Spanish are the first to bring slaves from Africa to basically the Caribbean. Okay. The Portuguese had already started taking Africans from the west coast of Africa up to Portugal to be slaves, okay, to work on farms. But now that there was a need for labor in the Americas to work in these mines and then to farm, you start to see that in the 15th century. So that's 1400 is what that is. 1500s, you start to see more. Okay. By the 16th century, so that's 1600s, 16,000 slaves are being brought across the Atlantic Ocean. During the 1700s, so one span of 100 years, you have 7 million slaves brought across the Atlantic Ocean in 1 year. Is that a lot? That's 7 times the population of Indianapolis, Marion County, being brought over in these gross boats and in awful, inhumane conditions. Okay, 80% of slaves are brought in the 1700s. Wrap your head around that. So the thing is if you think about that, 1700s is when the United States became a country, right? 1776, independence. French Revolution, etc. But still a lot of slaves. Now, the 1800s, it slows down, but still 1.7 million slaves brought to Cuba and Brazil because of sugar. Sugar. Everybody likes sugar. Okay. All right. So take a look at the screen here. Okay. When you look at the screen, what I wanted to show you was the West African coast right here was where the majority of slaves would exit to the Americas. And where would they go? 48% of all slaves were taken to Brazil. Okay. You're going to say, why would 48% of all slaves of the 10 to 12 million be taken to Brazil? Because of how hard the labor was in Brazil. Sugar plantation labor. I'm going to explain to you what that looked like, how deadly it was. Okay. 41% of all slaves were taken to these islands called the Caribbean. Okay. If you go to Jamaica today, you can look at the racial makeup of Jamaica, like the country today. And the permanent citizens that make up the country of Jamaica, 98% of them can trace their lineage back to the continent of Africa. That's how many more slaves there were than Europeans there. Okay? That's how many people were brought to work on these plantations. Okay? So 48% here, 41% here. Most of you are good enough at math to realize that that's 89% of slaves were brought to either the Caribbean or Brazil. Okay? Now, how many were brought to the United States? 5%. Good math. But 5% were brought to, well, not the United States that time, but the 13 colonies. Okay? And the reason why you have a larger percentage of African Americans in the United States is that slavery in the United States was not sugar plantation slavery, and so more slaves were able to reproduce and had a longer average lifespan. The average lifespan of slaves in Brazil and the Caribbean was 23 years. That's how long the average slave lived. 23. Okay? In the Middle Ages, when life was awful in Europe, like this downright terrible, people lived the average age of 35. Okay, serfs, peasants. Figure that out. Do the math on that. Okay. Now, other things I wanted you to see. Most people don't recognize this, but at the same period of time, okay, over a span of about 300 years, still 700 slaves are taken to other areas of the around Indonesia, India, in the Indian Ocean. Okay, 500,000 women are still traded as concubines in the Arab world. All right, so while slaves were moving to the Americas, there was still slavery and people being taken from the continent of Africa into Arabia and into the Indian Ocean trade network. All right, so yesterday we talked about the triangular trade. Okay, the second leg of triangular trade was known as the Middle Passage, and 1 to 2 million Africans died in the Middle Passage. Why? What do you mean small? Living space was small. Yeah. Anything else you can tell from these pictures? Yeah. Yeah. Okay. It's called the coffin position. You'll see it right here. Okay. Slaves were packed in. It was legal. And for those of you that aren't in the room, I'm going to draw this out for those people in the room. This is the amount of space that a slave was legally supposed to have for the British government. 12 inches, and then 6 more, and then 12 inches. Okay, so that right into a box was the amount of area a slave could have. It equated to 4 square feet of room. 4 square feet. Legally, that's what the British Empire said you had to have on a slave ship. Okay? So, in squelching heat, you're crossing basically the Atlantic Ocean on the equator, which is the hottest place on Earth, right? In a, 3 or 4 levels down on a ship with no air moving, you're only brought up once or twice a day to be able to go to the bathroom or get some food or see some fresh air. And then over time, they would shackle the slaves in here so they would have shackles on their hands and on their feet, couldn't move anywhere. Think about how dehumanizing and how you are totally destroying a person's mental psyche by doing this. Okay? The fact that anybody lived through this is amazing. Now, that's why when they say 10 to 12 million Africans were taken, they don't know the numbers because slave ships would pack on way more slaves than their numbers said they were allowed to. And then they would lie about the numbers because they knew so many would die on the passage across from Africa to the Caribbean or Africa to Brazil. All right. One of the things that would happen is at first they didn't realize that slaves would kill themselves because it was horrible. And so you saw Africans would stop eating, they would lose weight, they would become extremely dehydrated. And so sharks actually would follow the ships because when someone died on the ship, they just throw them over. So you had these sharks following these ships, waiting to feast on dead bodies. Slaves had to endure not only like this mental, like the agony of this being taken from their home, but then they also had to, they then realized that they had to keep them alive. So they would then punish the slaves for not eating. All right, because they realized that they had the slave owner of a ship only got paid for how many slaves he brought across the Atlantic he could sell. So they would actually pay them, they would torture them if they didn't eat or if they didn't do their exercises or their stretching. That's how brutal it was. Okay. Now, when they got to the Americas, they were sold for basically they were sold for what's called an Indies piece. You know how Christopher Columbus inaccurately called the Americas the Indies, right? The West Indies. And so in the Spanish and Portuguese world, they came up with a term called the Indies piece, and that was a term that they used for a healthy male slave, was one Indies piece. If it was a male slave that looked sick or odd, half an Indies piece. If it was a female, a quarter of an Indies piece. Okay? And it all came down to how much you'd be able to labor. And this labor, which was so painstaking, was done on sugar plantations in the Americas. Okay? So these sugar plantations, okay, were often done in hilly areas. And so to fertilize the sugar plantations, they had to take 80-pound, basically baskets of manure. Yes, horse poop, okay? Carry them over their head to fertilize the sugarcane. Then, once they cut the sugarcane, it had to be processed, as you see going on right here, within 48 hours. Or else the sugarcane, the liquid from it went bad and you couldn't turn it into pure sugar. And so if you look at this picture, you see sugar being, like the sugarcane being brought into the middle here. You see cattle crushing it, and then you see it being turned into a liquid form where it would be boiled, and then it would be, you can see they would be thrown into ovens, and then it would turn into sugar, okay? That process, because it was so important to turn over that plant into sugar, again, 48-hour process meant that slaves would be on the job for 48 hours straight. Okay, that's almost nothing compared to when child labor in the Industrial Revolution, children were working 15 hours a day. Everyone thought that was crazy. Well, this is way worse. All right, and it was so bad. There were so many different mechanical parts going on here that oftentimes the slave masters would carry hatchets or machetes on them. And if somebody nicked their arm or something, they would just cut it off on the spot because they didn't have time to patch it up. It's absolutely terrible. All right, so a little bit of information here for you, okay? Slavery had been common. Mariah pointed that out. Kingdoms like the Congo, the Ghana, Benin, Mali, Songhai, they had slaves, okay? But all land was owned by the state, and owning slaves was just a way to gain wealth. and you would sell the slaves, or they could work their way to gain their freedom, or they'd be traded. But they were not used so much for labor as they were used as like household servants, again, concubines, some field workers, but it was not this same type of unnatural labor that they were used for in the Americas. When the Europeans arrived with guns, that would change the ball game. All right, so what that led to then was competition between rival kingdoms will lead to endless wars. So if you look up at this map right here, okay, there were thousands of kingdoms in the continent of Africa before the Europeans arrived. The Europeans arrived, and all of a sudden you see kingdoms like the Ashanti and the Dahomey, which happen to be in the areas where the Europeans, if you look at these little dots, had most of their ports where they would come and basically where slave raiders would bring the slaves to these ports. Then all of a sudden, these were the kingdoms that became the most powerful, and they got the most guns, and they got the most, alcohol and different products from Europe. And then they were able to essentially take over this whole area because of these slave raids. And so the slave trade shifts the balance of power, and where it used to be this area where there was gold, this is Timbuktu. I think most of you learned about Timbuktu first semester, even if you were in another class. Instead of it being about gold and salt, which it used to be in the West Africa where the power was, it now moved down to the coast where the Ashanti and the Dahomey were. Okay. All right. So this is the picture of the fort of Elmina. It's still there today. Okay, which is modern day. I want to say modern day Ghana, and this is probably the most famous fort. And 2/3 of the slave trade went through this fort. Okay, which was originally Dutch or Portuguese, then Dutch, and then every European country used it. And this was in the Ashanti Kingdom. All right, I told you a little bit about the Kingdom of the Congo yesterday. The Kingdom of the Congo is along the Congo River Basin. People don't realize how big the Congo is because it's in the interior of Africa. And if you look at a world map, the things that are in the middle are always smashed together more. So Congo is an absolutely huge country, okay? But it doesn't look like it on a map. So the people of the Congo had already had a very sophisticated society, like the Aztec and the Inca. Your Portuguese show up, they convert to Christianity, the upper class does, thinking that they could be on equal level with the Portuguese. But over time, they recognized that a lot of their slaves were being taken, or a lot of their like lower class people who were their farmers and workers were being taken and just kidnapped. So the king, again, even his son became the first priest from an African kingdom. He sent a letter to the Pope begging him to not take his people. And the Pope said, I'm sorry, but this is how it's going to be because this is mercantilism. And he didn't do anything about it. And so Portugal, essentially, you can see how sophisticated this was. Luongo. I mean, they had huge, huge streets, tons and tons of ivory, and they're basically wiped off the earth because of the slave trade. All right. Last but not least, you've heard of Cape Town or South Africa before, the country? Yes? So I would say maybe you've heard of apartheid, or you learned about that in middle school, which was the racial system that was put in place after World War II in South Africa. Okay, Nelson Mandela famously was jailed for 27 years in his fight to end apartheid. Well, those roots go all the way back to when the Dutch East India Company, that trading company we talked about, they established a colony on the bottom of South Africa in order to have a trading spot or a place to like put goods when they went and traded with their Indonesia. That was kind of the place where their spices were. People started living there because they realized the land was more fertile there than it was in the Netherlands. Netherlands is a swamp. If you've ever flown into Amsterdam, you'll see that half the country's underwater. Not good for growing things. All right. So there they enslaved the natives and they brought slaves from Indonesia. And if you see this, by the time I think this is by 1800, there were 17,000 white European settlers, 26,000 slaves that they had brought in from other areas of the world, and 14,000 natives that were slaves too. And so they're called the Boers. They're the ones that will fight against the English eventually when the English take over South Africa. But they made slavery part of that. And that's why, again, that racial injustice that still takes place there today. If you've ever go, I haven't been to South Africa. I've had quite a few friends that have traveled there. It's very obvious, okay? And again, the seeds of that all go back to the establishment of this Cape Colony. Okay, for those of you on Zoom here, I'm going to stop the show and we're going to transition into a different activity. So those of you in the room, what I'm looking for you to do is go onto your Canvas, please. I saw a couple of you already there. I haven't used this little screen in a long time. All right. Take me back here. So I'm going to go ahead and share the oh, this is gonna be annoying. All right, so we're in modules here. Click on modules. Go down to week number 3. Your intro that we did in class yesterday. Xavier, you're the only one that might not have it done. We'll go. I'll have Mr. Renshaw maybe work on some answers with you in a minute. Okay. Remember, this is due by 11 o'clock today. 65 out of about 89 turned in. So if you're out there on Zoom and you weren't paying attention yesterday, turn that in, please. Second thing then, today we are going to take a look at some primary sources. All right. So says answer the questions of the documents and upload them to Canvas when you are done. This should be completed in class. So you're going to need to upload this, and then there are only 3 questions. Okay? Read the document, answer the question, read the document, answer the question, and then the third document is the picture you've already seen and answer that question. Okay? Looking for you to get this done. For those on Zoom, you've got about 22 minutes. Once you're done, you can log off. Those of you in the classroom, pull this up. I'm going to do the first one together with you, okay? Again, those of you on Zoom, you're supposed to be working through this, these 3 documents. There's only 1 question for each document. If you're confused on one, go ahead and ask a question in the chat box. If not, again, I'm just going to, I'll be here if you have a question, but I'm gonna be working with the people in class. When you are done, upload it as your assignment for today and work on other stuff or take a break for your next class.